We're going to get started. Thank you for joining. This session is dollar store expansion and implications for not just food policy. If you caught the sign on the outside, you'll notice that it was a bit cut off. So just in case you were on the edge of your seats, this is the full title of the session. We are formatted a little bit differently than you might be familiar with in your other attended sessions today. We are a panel discussion. So all of our speakers are going to be sitting at the front of the room, and we're going to be mostly just walking you all through some of our sponsored research projects, and all of our sponsors. Our sponsor is common among us, the USDA. So just to give you a little bit of info about today's panel discussion, we're focusing on dollar stores. Why? Okay, so dollar stores, and I'll just read this all for you, have become the fastest growing retail outlet that sells food. Due to overwhelming public distrust in their expansion, much speculation exists about their impact on local retail competition and public health. Research has shown that the supply of supermarkets in high and low income neighborhoods explains only 10% of the variation in nutritional value of households' food choices. So while policy tools seek to expand access to supermarkets and large grocery stores, dollar stores may actually be filling a gap in access where other outlets are not profitable. But so could dollar stores be the next major disruptor in the food retail sector? These and many other questions remain. So our panelists are all going to comment to some extent on any number of issues that pertain roughly to the core of this narrative. And just to give you a sense of who we all are, I'm Lauren Cheneritas. I'm an assistant professor at Arizona State University. I'm joined by Connor Mullally, who's an associate professor at University of Florida, Metin Chakar at the University of Minnesota, associate professor, Sandra Steinbeck, assistant professor at UConn, and then Sean Cash here is a professor at Tufts University, and he's going to serve as our moderator and going to give a really riveting intro for all of us. So hold on to your seats, everybody. A standard disclaimer and acknowledgement here. Our work, as I mentioned, is all supported by USDA sponsored awards through the Economic Research Service and AFRI-NEFA. And our disclaimer here, I can read it for you as well. The findings and conclusions in this preliminary presentation have not been formally disseminated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and should not be construed to represent any agency determination or policy. This research was supported in part by the Intramural Research Program of the USDA. The findings and conclusions in this manuscript are those of the authors and should not be construed to represent any official USDA or US government determination or policy. And I also have to say that these analysis findings and conclusions expressed in the presentation should not be attributed to Nielsen or IRI. That being said, we don't actually have any results that we're presenting other than what has been published in the literature. So I'm just doing this to cover my bases. So there we go. Now I'm going to kick it over to Sean. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks everyone here. I'm just going to take a few minutes of introduction. I'm going to set a timer so that I don't take too long to just kind of remind us of why it is important. I think if you're in this room, you know these things are important, but just kind of present a little bit of some anecdotes and facts to set the stage for that. So, and dollar stores have become an increasingly important source of food acquisition for many households. It's been growing by percentage terms. It's the fastest growing part of the food retail landscape in the United States. And I think it's still something that we've not caught up to in the research world. And that was something that my colleague Wenwei Fang and I were reflecting on at Tufts a few years ago. And we started looking around and finding like-minded people who had also come to the same realization. So, we did a systematic review at Tufts that we're working on getting out the door, and there's not a lot out there. And what is out there is fairly limited in scope, but also some of the best stuff is yet to come, including some of the things that the people here are working on today. Just also want to mention that in addition to some of the work that people will be talking about today, we actually hosted a workshop at Tufts 2 months ago. The FADS workshop, the clever acronym, was not the best part of the workshop by any means, but we brought together folks from the nutrition research worlds, community nutrition folks, along with economists, business researchers, et cetera, to really try to get at this in an interdisciplinary way and we talked a lot about things like data sources and data gaps and things like that. So we'll have some translational outputs from this workshop that we'll have to share over the coming weeks as well. So this is a meme that I stumbled upon last year, and I just like it because it reflects how much it feels. We look around and see this growth of dollar stores, that everywhere dollar stores seem to be just popping up. And I like that this was over a tractor in a solitary landscape, because the importance of dollar stores and the growth of dollar stores in rural areas is particularly salient. So, but it's not just rural areas, it's smaller towns, suburbs, cities, everywhere. The growth has been fast and it's been constant since about 2008. Really, the financial crisis 2008 was a takeoff point for dollar stores, but it hasn't slowed in boom times or bust since then. So we've seen the sharp increase since 2008, with about 1,000 new stores that opened in 2021, and actually slightly higher planned number for 2022 from the major chains from what I've seen. Just for some comparison points here, Dollar General sales increased 20% in 2020 chain-wide. This growth, as we mentioned, is especially important in rural areas, communities with lower incomes, and the food options are growing as well. But a lot of what we see on the shelves are not necessarily the things that we think we want to see promoted more from a health point of view. So this is a concern. Part of the work we've been doing at Tufts, also through a cooperative agreement, like some of the all the projects here today, has been trying to look at really what are the implications of that. It's one thing to say, to look on the shelves and see what's being sold, but what we really care about is what households are acquiring and what our dietary patterns look like. And so it might not be as it first appears. And then the concern at a policy level, potentially, and in the marketplace, is that this rise of dollar stores might be crowding out other retailers, or is it filling gaps that other retailers were already leaving vacant? If we look at the top 10 national food retail chains here, and this is a slide that I borrowed from one of Lauren's presentations a few months ago, we see that here, the type of small, but Dollar Tree, Family Dollar, Dollar General, by number of locations, by far more locations than any of the competitors. Walmart's the next one, Aldi's after that, Ahold Delhaize, which is actually a series of regional chains that maybe Alberts, and so on and so on. Right. So really, this is by sheer number of locations. These are major retailers. Looking at the maps here, the big $3 stores, this is a per capita map from the work of Jerry Shannon, who's a geographer who's been looking at dollar stores the last few years. And we see this, it is all over the country, but we see a heavy concentration, particularly per capita wise, in the southern and southeastern United States. Another way of looking at this is from some of Lauren's work. This was in Applied Geography where you published this, that just this growth from 2000 to 2017, how much that growth has occurred and changed. And there's a lot of neat stuff in Lauren's paper from last year that I encourage you to look at. And this is just a little bit more about the entry, and this is part of what I alluded to earlier, that this growth has been going on since 2008. And it's really, when times are bad, dollar stores do well. When times are good, dollar stores do well. That's just been the dynamic of the last 15 years. And that seems to, and this particular graph ends in 2019, but the rate of growth has accelerated again since the pandemic, right? So there'd be more tall bars if you did the same one for the last few years. Dollar Tree acquired Family Dollar in 2015. That's why you lose one color there. But there is differences in the positioning and marketing of the two brands, even if it's now one company. Wenwei has been tossing around this analogy for a while, and with all the things we can critique of the food desert framing and analogy, it does seem that perhaps dollar stores are the food cactus, right? That the dollar stores seem to survive and thrive in harsh environments where other retailers do not seem to be well suited to survive. So we could think about this analogy for a while, but this is something we've been playing around with because, again, it comes to this question of what does this mean for the quality of what we're eating and ultimately for our health. If we see dollar stores as these evil entities selling inferior food and crowding out other folks, and that has a very different flavor than if it's providing additional access, even if only to a relatively limited selection in places that otherwise would not have as many sources and access. Another analogy or parallel that we've been playing around with in our discussions the last few years is just the parallel with the supercenter. And I think this is a pretty relevant parallel because in the early 2000s, there was a lot of common stigma against supercenters as well, a lot of concern about what that meant, critiques of the food mixes at supercenters and the like, and we've seen that change. The food mix has broadened out. I got here on Friday evening and I walked over to Target to buy groceries, right? And, I didn't, I didn't think of it as a non-preferred outlet. I knew that being in a different city, I'd have some sense of what I could buy there. Also, public attitudes towards the role and relevance of these supercenters have changed over the last 20 years. So dollar stores are growing fast. It'd be foolish and arrogant to think that somehow we're observing the final form, whether it's a space alien or a food cactus, they're going to keep evolving, and we should keep in mind that we'll be more familiar with them, if not more accepting, over the years. So this is from some of our work at Tufts, and this is a piece that's currently under review, right? Is this one just a household dollar store food purchases by income? This is from some IRI data, but just also where you see a clear pattern. The percentage of food dollars spent is much higher for households with lower incomes, and that pretty consistently drops off as the income goes up. So overall, it seems that food purchases at dollar stores are inferior goods. And we don't have it by number of trips or other things that we could break down, but I think we'd see similar patterns there as well. So with food purchases, dollar store food expenditures have increased 72.7% from 2008 to 2019 and fully doubled in rural areas during that same time frame. And again, we see this broad spread. And the growth of dollar stores is a clear trend in the data, whether you're looking at TD Link's location data or what we can observe about food purchases in IRI data and other data sources. Lower income households, rural areas, and consumers of color are where we see the fastest growth over this time period. Here is a little bit of unpublished work, but you could see a lot more of this in the poster around the corner that I assume is still up. And this is just looking at that dietary quality issue that the HEI scores inform in this form. So here, this is the overall. We see that the HEI scores for dollar stores for the foods purchased there on average are lower than any other retail format other than convenience stores with similar HEI score. And this one is just the decomposition by the major categories, the major components of the HEI. So we do indeed see that these food products are not as good from a dietary quality point of view. What I didn't show here, go and look at the poster. There's a lot of substituting going on though. So when you look at the overall mix or HEI scores for households that are frequent dollar store shoppers compared to those who aren't, there's a gap that's statistically significant, but very small. So from what we're seeing in the scanner data, people are buying lower quality food items from an HEI point of view in dollar stores, but then they're probably using the money they're not spending in the dollar store and using that to buy higher quality things elsewhere. Seems to be a pattern overall in large in terms of the means. Coming forward to the pandemic, consumer visits to dollar stores went up during the pandemic. And some of the early data, this was a Food Navigator piece, was just based on cell phone tracking data. And I know that there's a group that's been looking at that more carefully than these initial industry reports that came out. But visits went up and the number of separate purchases per visit went up. People going and paying with multiple payment formats. And I think that's all sorts of things. People were looking for items that weren't readily available in the early months of the pandemic. Dollar stores carry a lot of shelf-stable items, toilet paper, other things that people might not have been finding as easily or wanting to stock up on more, as well as concerns about income that might have been driving people to dollar stores. Start fast forwarding a little bit more through the pandemic. Dollar store chains, pandemic's big winners so far. Increased hiring 50,000 last year. So 2021, we still saw this growth. So number of visits went up. 2021 number of locations and hiring went up. And then moving forward again into just a few months ago, we've had a few stock market dips in the last few months. Don't look at your retirement accounts, right? But one of the big ones in the last 2 months was set off by Target and Walmart reporting a drop in their sales. And true to form, even so that concerned people about retailer sales and consumer confidence, everything else, dollar stores were doing better than ever at the same time. So at the same time that the stock market was taking a hit because of concerns about the US retail consumer, dollar stores were still doing well. So they really seem to right now be resilient to both bad times and good. I know that Lauren has some comments prepared or is prepared to answer questions and has some comments on policy stuff, but we have seen policy responses. So several localities have imposed policies to restrict construction of new dollar stores, concerns that the dollar stores are selling lower quality items and trying to keep that out. Many of these towns in this review by McCarthy, actually, we have a 2020 date that was from a presentation. The paper just came out this week now in Nutrients, so take a look at that updated. A few of those towns are kind of doing a NIMBY thing where it seems that it might be slightly higher income communities that don't like dollar stores, but a lot of the towns, the majority of towns that were imposing these local restrictions were actually not particularly high income towns, right? And they were concerned about the quality of the foods rather than the appearance of the dollar stores or other things. The updated retailer standards, really food diversity standards to be able to participate in SNAP, they were several years in the making, started taking effect in 2018, but they really had dollar stores as well as convenience stores and drug stores in the targets, in the sites is what was relevant for requiring a broader set of foods for anyone who's going to be a SNAP authorized retailer. And of course, all this is going on without a good evidence base about what it actually means for food access or dietary quality or how far people's food dollars go. So that's part of what folks in this room are trying to help establish, that evidence base. Really fast, of course, it's not just policy responses. There are have been responses from the industry based on some of these pressures. So we see things like these initiatives, DG Fresh and things like that, where you see a much nicer set of produce on offer. And this photo is taken, by the way, from an article explaining how that the original article talking about how DG Fresh was coming to this community was an error and that it wasn't. So this is a thing that's happening. The stores are experimenting with these formats. It's not universal. It's not even common. And a lot of the DG Fresh locations actually are in neighborhoods with higher average incomes than the general footprint of these stores. So maybe this is a way forward, but this is still a small part of the story. All right, so that's all I'll have to say there out of interest of time, but just I wanted to set the stage for part of why this was important and give some of the larger context for some of the specific projects that our panelists have been working on. So Lauren, in pulling this together, kind of identified 4 core research themes that some of the projects she was familiar with were covering: retail geography and equity, open and fair markets, rural economic development, and food and nutritional security. And with those in mind, we're going to pose these 4 questions to our panelists for the remainder of our time. One, how was dollar store expansion illuminated inequalities, particularly with respect to food access? 2, how does dollar store expansion affect local retail competition, including food prices and price markups? 3, as dollar stores expand, what geographical differences across the US exist with respect to labor and incumbent store behavior? And 4, in what ways could dollar store expansion support access to nutritious foods? So with that, I'm going to unmute the microphone over there and invite each panelist to say a little bit more, just to introduce the general framing of their individual cooperative agreement projects before we dive into the conversation. Lauren?
I meant to add the titles. I'm using Connor's screen just to make sure I stay on point. So the project that I'm going to be representing today is USDA ERS food cooperative agreement. And we were looking at the introduction of low-cost variety stores and their impact on the local food retail environment and consumer spending. The research team that I assembled to carry out this project was in collaboration with Michael Thompson, who's at the University of Arkansas, Rudy Naiga at Texas A&M, Claire Cho, who was at USDA or at ERS, now is at the CRS, and then Pat McLaughlin at ERS. Overall, our objective was to provide insights regarding the impact of dollar store entry on the food retail environment and patterns of food access. And you can see just on the right-hand side a summary of some of our research objectives. Overall, we were really interested in this question of were dollar stores or have dollar stores filled gaps in food access. And I'm going to be able to explain sort of what we've done, what we did to go ahead and tackle this objective, and also share with you some of the findings that have motivated additional research that we're working on.
Thank you, Lauren. Connor?
Hi, I'm Connor Malawi, Associate Professor at University of Florida. I'm also leading a cooperative agreement with USDA to look at dollar stores. Other members of my team include Chuck Grigsby, who's a PhD candidate at University of Florida, Ricky Volpe, who's an associate professor at, he might be full professor, I'm not sure, at Cal Poly, and then Alex Stevens from USDA ERS. I'll have to ask. Our research objective is to look at the consequences of dollar store growth on U.S. retail market structure. We are probably amongst the other panelists teams here in the early stages of our project. So what exactly we'll end up doing is a bit in flux, but a bit of a summary of what we're doing is we're combining public and private sources with machine learning, geospatial methods, and econometric methods to investigate the growth and locational patterns of dollar stores with respect to their store demographic, socioeconomic, and market level characteristics. So really, that's a long-winded way of saying we are taking data to the narrative around dollar stores to see how well what is kind of the accepted conventional wisdom around dollar stores, how well that matches the data and how much that has changed over time. Also looking at impacts of dollar store growth on changes in household purchasing behavior and how dollar store entry affects incumbent independent grocery stores. Okay, and next.
Thank you, Metin.
Thanks, Connor. So, hello, everyone. This is Metin Çakır. I'm an associate professor at the University of Minnesota. The research I'm gonna talk about today is an FAAEA grant led by Lauren and the collaborative between Arizona, the Arizona State and the University of Minnesota. Our objective with this grant was to develop a comprehensive analysis of dollar store, mostly competitive effect, its prices and the effects on food insecurity. So in summary, so that's our the overarching objective is almost like all things about dollar store. But what we wanted to get at is estimate this first start with reduced form analysis, find out stylized facts about the causal impact of dollar store entry. As in a second objective, our goal was test the strategic motives of dollar store entry using a dynamic discrete modeling framework. That paper is actually out. So the topic that I'm going to discuss today is hopefully it's like our second paper, mostly focusing on dollar store impact on food prices, which is relatively in early stages. And hopefully we'll have more papers. And another goal is talking about getting into the effect of dollar stores on food insecurity. So that's our project. But the part that I'll be talking mostly today is dollar stores and prices.
Sandro?
And scream. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Sandro and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut, and this is a joint work with Rigoberto Lopez, who's also at the University of Connecticut, and our team at ES, Keenan Machesi, and Timothy Park, actually. So our goal, the goal of our ES-funded cooperative agreement is to get a better understanding of what is the implication of retail competition in world food markets, particularly looking at the impact of dollar stores and independent grocery retailers. And here we are interested in what is their survivability, how does it change with an entry of dollar stores, and how that affects employment in terms of retail employment in rural food markets, as well as how that affects sales of incumbent companies. So in that sense, why we I think I summarized the right side as well, and I think we go for the next step.
Great, and I did show you a few slides from some of our results, but I didn't fully acknowledge that that's also through a cooperative agreement with ERS. Alina Page is our primary collaborator ERS, and Wenwei Feng is the PI of that project at Tufts. So, all right, let's dive into.
Sorry, I also would like to add on that Alfie project, I think, fully disclose our collaborators. So it's Tim Richards and Patrick.
Oh, yeah, Patrick McLaughlin.
Yeah, Patrick McLaughlin, Tim Richards, Lauren, and I. Thank you. So just want to acknowledge them too.
All right, so let's move into our first question. And for each of these, we've kind of identified two key respondents. I know they have a few things prepared. And then, Lauren, did we want to invite questions, add-ons with each question, or just at the end?
So I think we have about an hour left and 4 questions.
15, yeah, okay. Okay, so great. So, all right. So this first question, Connor, what can you tell us about how dollar store expansion has illuminated inequalities, particularly with respect to food access?
Well, let's see. Go to the next slide. Might be able to tell you.
Oh, here we go.
So has dollar store expansion illuminated inequalities of any, particularly with respect to food access? So we know there's this narrative around dollar stores. They tend to serve specific types of consumers. So particularly low income consumers in urban areas, in census tracts that have high concentrations of minority populations. And then in rural areas, perhaps, predominantly white areas, but also low income, distant from grocery stores. And the consumers that are seen as being targeted by dollar stores predominantly are also those that we think of as suffering the most with respect to lack of access to healthy eating options, so are most likely to be located in food deserts. The fact that dollar stores are proliferating in areas and amongst demographic groups that might have the least access, otherwise have access to healthy eating options, you could look at that in 2 ways, right? There's a positive way to look at it, and that dollar stores are giving people an option where they might not otherwise have it if other retailers can't survive in those areas, and that's why they're not there. And there's also a negative way to look at this, right? That's perhaps dollar stores are exacerbating issues around lack of access, and they're doing that to the groups that suffer those issues more than anybody else in the US. So next slide, please. Okay. The question is whether this narrative around dollar stores, is that really just the product of anecdotal evidence, or is it matched by the data, what we see in reality? When I say anecdotal evidence, I'm thinking mostly of what you see in the media. If you read, if it's outside of a business journal or a trade journal, what you're going to read about dollar stores is going to tend to be negative. I would say that's a fair assessment. One place to start is to see what the major chains say about themselves. You can learn a fair amount about who the chains are looking to sell to by reading their annual reports. So if you look at what Dollar General says about who their customers are, they say that their core customers are low and fixed income households. And they seek to locate in stores in close proximity to our customers, which helps drive customer loyalty, trip frequency, and makes us an attractive alternative to large discount and other large box retail and grocery stores. So you might not necessarily find them in the same census tracts, for example, as a grocery store, but they do see themselves as an alternative to some of those more distant retailers. Family Dollar says similar things, lower than average income customers in urban and rural locations. That's what they see as their core customer base. Dollar Tree is kind of the outlier, right? They see their customers being having a broad range of incomes and being located in suburban areas. So at least when you look at the annual reports, it seems that out of the 3 major chains, Dollar General and Family Dollar are most likely to match that's kind of prevailing negative narrative around dollar stores and who their customers are. Next slide. But we want to go beyond looking just at the annual reports and take some data to the question. And I'm not actually going to present any results today. I'm just going to talk about our approach, how one might go about answering these questions, mostly because I don't have permission from Nielsen to share any results today. But that's fine.
And we also want to look at not just at a snapshot moment in time, but how the match between the narrative and reality has evolved over time. Perhaps at one moment, Dollar General, for example, was exclusively targeting low-income consumers in predominantly rural areas, but maybe that's different now. To do that, we needed data on the locations of dollar stores and other retailers over time, as well as census tract characteristics. So the characteristics of the places where the stores are locating to see, again, how that narrative matches the data and vice versa. So we got access to a TD Links data set from Nielsen through our agreement with USDA, census data, the American Community Survey to get information on demographics, annual reports from the major chains to look at, say, locations of distribution centers, road network data, and data from Department of Homeland Security on gathering places, just to tell a richer story about where the major chains are locating. Sure, maybe they're locating in far-flung, remote rural areas, but perhaps they're picking the most central locations within those areas possible, just to go a bit beyond that narrative and try to tell a richer story. We needed methods that would allow us to tell a rich descriptive story. So we settled on using machine learning approaches, using random forests, gradient boosting, and penalized regression. But in order to be able to tell a story, we needed methods that were interpretable, right? So if you're familiar at all with machine learning, it's a powerful set of predictive algorithms that can do a great job of, for example, predicting the locations of dollar stores, which is exactly what we're doing here. But they don't always do a good job with interpretability. So we're economists, we tend to use just like OLS most of the time, maybe, get fancy and use a nonlinear regression method once in a while. And we're a bit spoiled in the sense that regression results tell a lot with just they can convey a lot of information easily, right? You get your sign of the effect, you get your magnitude of the effect, and you get your precision of the effect just out of two numbers. Random forest or gradient boosting might be able to match the data more accurately than a regression, but it's a lot tougher to get those three pieces of information across, especially if you want to do so year by year, chain by chain, urban versus rural and different regions of the US. All of a sudden, you're talking about a lot of numbers to try to present what really should be an easily communicated story. So that was something that we had to wrestle with. And we also needed adequate computing power. So if you've ever worked with access data through ERS, you have to work on their closed system, and it's I don't know, has like one core and hardly any memory, and trying to do machine learning on that system was extremely challenging. So what we had to do was aggregate things up to the census tract level, which made it possible for us to export the data off that system and then work at the Hypergator computing facility at University of Florida, where it's basically like our private AWS system, where you can expand how much memory and number of cores that you have access to do your analysis. That work is in progress at the moment, and hopefully next time I come talk to you, I'll have interesting results to share that. And next slide.
I think this is queuing us up for Lauren. And while you're moving the machine, I'll just mention Connor had referenced as a touch point for this kind of the media narrative, right? And that's something we have a project, Wenwei and Lauren and I are working with some other colleagues on doing a content analysis of some of this media reporting. And if you look at the local level, the most common thing being reported on is crime. But even once you get past that, both the local and national level, a lot of negative reporting. And again, that's very different from what you see in the annual reports. Lauren, you're going to talk to us about whether or not dollar stores are filling a gap in food access where traditional retailers have not been entering.
That is true. And this is published work in applied geography, and I'm going to, and it's most closely related to the cooperative agreement with Mike Thompson, Rudy Niga, Claire Cho, Pat McLaughlin. And I'm going to highlight sort of like a bit of the approach that we took to develop the data, the analytical data set that we needed to answer that question. And then I'm going to walk you through some of the hypotheses that we generated from the literature, and then walk you through just some high level results of what we found that then served as additional motivation for future research that Metin and team and I are working on. So this question of dollar stores and whether they fill a gap in food access, I mean, there's two things that one would need to know to answer this question. And the first thing that we'd need to know is, okay, we have to track dollar store expansion. And so in the first part of the data set that I compiled, it was looking at dollar store entry. And there are many different ways that, or data proprietors that one could use to track dollar store entry, but the data set that we used for this project is from Nielsen's TD-Link's store characteristics database. And what I love about this data set is that it's a repeated cross-section of food retail establishments, and it breaks everything down at the format level. And in fact, it actually breaks everything down at the exact store location, but then classifies each store according to their particular format. And it gives a comprehensive listing of these food retailers across the United States. And as Shawn had mentioned earlier too, there really wasn't the scope of the research on dollar stores is pretty minimal at this point when we were starting to answer or ask this question back in 2018. And particularly among the literature that was published on dollar stores, it was very local level. So, New York or North Carolina, Minnesota, very, very small. So we wanted to look more at a national level and so describe some of the overall patterns that we were seeing about dollar store expansion. So that's why we're using TD-Link's data as well, because it's covering the entire United States. And here's just some other information about the data: store names, ownership, other measures of location, sales volume, and food sales. And we use some of these variables, but what's key about this is we have the entry date. And that's going to be important in our analysis. We also have each store is assigned to a specific code that is linked to a physical location, again, so we can get at the precision of the store location entry. And we use data from actually 2004 to 2017 was our analysis. We did not have, at the time of doing writing this paper, we only had data up through 2017, but the analysis could be replicated to include years beyond 2017. So that's the first part of the data set that we needed to construct in order to answer this question, or kind of, test these hypotheses that I'll pose in a moment. The second half of this research question required us to identify what are areas of poor food access, or how would we classify that? And what we did here is we relied on methodology from the USDA's Economic Research Service, the Food Access Research Atlas. Now, the Food Access Research Atlas, these are they're census tract level measures of food accessibility, and food accessibility is essentially classified in a number of ways, but you might know of the term food desert. We actually aptly named this paper Dollar Stores and Food Deserts, but I tend to steer away from that terminology just because I don't think it really describes much. So instead, we're classifying areas or calling areas low income, low access, which is consistent with the Food Access Research Atlas. Now, the thing about the Food Access Research Atlas is it's only collected like 2 or 3 times. And in order to look at the temporal changes in dollar store expansions, association with changes in food accessibility, we would need to calculate this measure yearly. And that's why we're relying on the methodology from the USDA. So we replicated their approach, but annually, because we had access to all the data that was necessary to construct these food access measures. And we were able to identify not only at the census tract level, but at the block group level, whether that block group was low access, where there's no supermarket located within some mile radius from a census block group centroid, whether that census block group was low income, where low income is defined as having a certain portion of the population whose median income was below 80% of the state median, or at least 20% of households were below poverty, and then no vehicle. So there are as I mentioned, there are several ways that one can classify a region as low income, low access. So one way is to say, okay, strictly low income, low access using those first two bullet points. And then another way of doing it is low income, low access and no vehicle. So we ran a number of tests, a number of models that looked at different measures of low income, low access or LILA, and dollar store entry. All in all, the data composition process took as you can imagine, the longest amount of time, but we ended up with an analytical sample of over 1.5 million observations, which is at the block group state level by year. This is another map comparison from 2000 to 2017, similar to what Sean showed you before. And one of the really neat things about the analytical sample that we put together, particularly for the food access measure, is that we can identify counties, well, we can identify block groups that are persistently low income and low access. And no one's been able to really do that before what we put together this sample. And that to me is really important because those are the areas where I think of as being, those in Sean's little meme of the alien, those persistent areas that are resource deficient, perhaps in some way. I'm being very general here, but we noticed that the share of persistent food deserts is highest in New York, Kings County, which is kind of in the Northeast there, California, Los Angeles County, which is, right in the backyard here, and then in Harris County, Texas. So you're looking at a map here, 2000 to 2007, and the darker shades are going to be those areas where we have a higher number of census block groups within the county that are flagged as a LILA block group. So these LILA measures are binary, so it's either 0 or 1 if it meets those criteria. And so what you're looking at here is just a comparison, and you can just notice that those darker shades are consistent across those two maps. And so the last kind of bit of results that I want to talk about, those were just some descriptive results that were interesting from our research, are a set of hypotheses that we generated from the literature that had also been, to some extent, discussed in this, what Connor was saying about the prevailing narrative of the media. And going into this, we did come up with these, based on the literature, what we would expect if we were to, before we were to analyze any of the data. And so what you're looking at here are just 3 of the, I think we had 5 or 6 hypotheses that we tested, a statement of what that hypothesis was, what outcome variable we were looking at, and then our explanatory variable of interest was either dollar store presence or the dollar store entry, and then the expected relationship that we would think. So for example, our first hypothesis, dollar stores are less likely to appear in food desert. We would expect that the dollar store presence on low income, low access is negative because if dollar store, let's see, so dollar stores are less likely to appear in food deserts, we expect that relationship to be negative because dollar stores wouldn't want to locate there because they're just like any other profit-seeking entity. So what we ended up finding was we can confirm this result. Through our analysis, we confirmed this relationship that block groups are less likely to be considered LILA when dollar stores are present, meaning that dollar stores are in areas where other retailers, other supermarkets exist. And we tested, we analyzed our data, or we estimated all of our equations using either OLS or logit regressions, and the results reported in our analysis are purely associative. That being said, they're consistent between both estimators. I'm going to walk you through just some of the other hypotheses that we posed, and then I'm going to wrap up from there. But dollar stores are less likely to enter a food desert, and we found that the odds of a block group being a food desert is less likely if a dollar store entered that year. Dollar stores are less likely to enter a persistent food desert. We expected this to be negative as well, just kind of this area where no business would want to be. Dollar stores are not more likely to enter persistent food desert areas. Next slide. The fourth hypothesis, dollar stores are less likely to enter a new food desert. Again, because we have this panel, we are able to see when a block group became a food desert, meaning that either a supermarket closed or poverty went over a specific threshold, because the food deserts could be calculated in either way. We found actually that a positive and significant relationship between dollar store entry and when an area becomes a food desert, but this result only held in metro areas. And then actually the most interesting finding out of the entire paper was this one. We wanted to look at, once a dollar store entered a food desert, would that area be more likely to remain a food desert? And what we did find is that after a dollar store enters into a LILA block group, it's more likely to remain LILA. So I jokingly say, it's like the smelly kid, smelly kid enters the room and then everyone leaves. But it seemed to be that dollar store exit rates, when we look conditioned on after a dollar store entered, the dollar store exit rates were lower in the LILA block groups compared to non-LILA. So there's something going on. Ultimately, there's something going on between dollar store entry, particularly in these food desert areas or the LILA block groups. And so we ended there because this is a very intense project, but teed it up for future work to estimate some of the causal effects of dollar store entry on local retail competition, and then pose other avenues to explore regarding the food quality itself. So that's what I will end with for now, and turn it over to the next set of speakers.
Great. Our next question is moving from food access to retail competition. How does dollar store expansion affect local retail competition, including looking at food prices and markups? So Metin, something to say on that?
Yeah, thank you, Sean. So is this my slide?
I just teed it up for you. This
Oh.
is just, you want me to talk about it?
Would be great. I'm not sure. Is this
Your
from
slide,
our
isn't it?
first one?
Do you want me to
Is it
move
from
on?
the-
We can
from the
just skip
first
this one
paper,
if you.
this slide?
It's mostly just teeing up what the question is so that everything is consistent with the other ones, but that's just me. But we can just go to you.
Okay.
Maybe just circle
Right,
that
there's a-
one.
Okay.
There's a rogue slide in our.
I threw off Met.
Sorry.
So I'll just quickly say, so this is on open and fair markets. And so the research project that Metin's going to be talking about prices. So there's there's some evidence that food prices are higher in areas deemed as food deserts compared to others that are not. And like if we're seeing this as a conversation of dollar store entry and food deserts, that's where I wanted to kind of tee up the thing, and then that leads into your objective.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's a great segue. Thank you.
And
Yeah.
this is going to be a great idea for a new set of sessions next year
Right.
with the
Right,
present
certainly.
to other people's slides.
Put yourself in a bingo.
Right.
I'm presenting today.
Next slide, please. Thank you. So our objective is again, the impact of dollar store expansion, dollar store entry on both competitive effects and prices. So to this end, one, we need a data set that will help us to track dollar store expansion. We need another data set that is going to help us to track prices. And we get those from, for the dollar store expansion, we use Dun & Bradstreet data, which was risky because really I did not know, we did not know a prior study that's using Dun & Bradstreet data. This is supposedly census of all establishments in the United States, right? If any establishment has any, financial, account with a financial institution, it makes it the Dun & Bradstreet data. Why is that good? Because because it's census of all establishments, right? So we have both small establishments, larger establishments. Using Dun & Bradstreet, we also have store locations. So we have the full address, we have the name of the name of the stores. There are SIC codes. So using the SIC codes, we extracted all competitors, grocery stores, convenience stores. But the dollar stores do not have their own SIC code. So we did the string search to extract dollar stores from Dun & Bradstreet data. And that is, so we did the top three Family Dollar, Dollar General, and Dollar Tree. For only those made it to our data set. So then at the end, for 3,000 counties, we have establishment information. This is tracking their entry, exit, expansion, just the location for 20 years. Then for price data, we used a point of sale store scanner data. It's many of you in the room, I'm assuming is familiar with the data. It's very large information on store level, the UPC level on food purchases. So using that, there are 14 product groups. We said we created, this is in the point of sale data, all UPC sales are at the largest. We started with the most aggregate, and then again, the early stages, eventually we want to make that more disaggregate. But right now for 14, we have created price indices for 14 product groups. And I'll be showing data for like those how those price indices look for 9 of them, because some of the product groups is like fresh seafood, not directly relevant. Maybe they changed, but the last time I looked, I don't think dollar stores were selling fresh seafoods, but so not including those. And the third source of data set is county level information, and that is we have 2 parts on that. One is information on income, population, unemployment rates, and then we use USDA's rough data set to classify counties as by their urban status. So next slide, thank you. So this is how our data looks. It is the left side is the map of dollar stores from Dun & Bradstreet data. Again, it is very consistent with other data source. So if you I'm not sure if you had it in this presentation, but if Tim Richards presented or the first paper that was using TD Lynx data and had a very similar map of dollar stores in the TD Lynx data, and the coverage is very similar. Most dollar stores are in East and Southeast, and some on the Southwest. And we have this expansion data for over 20 years. And the right side shows the price indices we generated using the store scanner data for the 9 product groups. It's a nice variation, so it is good to have that kind of variation. The sort of there is differences obviously in price levels of these groups, but also the price changes are also varying across group, which would give us like a nice variation for identification of whether or not dollar stores had impacted food prices. Next slide, please. So these are the 2 methods that we started with to work with. I will not go, it's the first is we estimated panel event study and the 2-way fixed effects. Sort of conceptually, panel event study fits better what's happening with the data, because so when we think of dollar store entry, if that's our treatment, this is a treatment that is changing over time and across space, right, in 2 dimensions, and panel event studies are well suited to analyze those. So that's sort of our main model. We said, okay, we'll estimate that. We also, but 2-way fixed effects is very common. So we are also estimating that to see, how results might be changing between the 2 models. So here, let me go back, Sean, to the, so I just want to mention, so our Y variable here, we have 2. One is number of other store formats, right? So this is very similar to, what Connor discussed, is like what's happening, whether other store formats are entering the market, exiting the market in response to dollar store expansion. And the other one, the other Y variable is the price index. And our main X variable here is we are just counting the dollar stores. There could be different measurements. Right now, it's only the total number of dollar stores in a county and our analysis at the county level. Next slide, please. So main is, the evidence at this point is extremely fuzzy, right? So it's still early stages, and we are in the process of sort of finalizing specifications. So, but here are our, the preliminary insights that what we are getting from these regressions results is that dollar store expansion is associated with other store, significantly associated with other store formats, entry and exit. But the direction of the relationship is mixed by, by the type of the store format. It is largely consistent. As I mentioned, this is second paper, and in the first paper, if you again attended Tim Richards presented it this morning, our main result there is that, and that's based on a structural dynamic oligopoly model of dollar store entry. The main result there is that the dollar store expansion is helping large store formats and hurting small store formats. And the impact here in this reduced form regression, what we are seeing generally largely consistent with that main finding, that between the store formats is the large store formats are actually not being hurt, the supercenters, large supermarkets, from entry of dollar stores. In terms of prices, we do find some significant associations. To my surprise, actually, I wasn't like starting to this research. I'm like, well, I'm not sure if you're gonna find anything here, but there is. But again, the evidence is fuzzy because it is mixed. So for some groups, for like beverages, which was expected, that we observe lower prices. That's like associated with dollars, significantly associated with dollar store entry. Perishable meat, perishable bakery, dairy, and other food are also, negatively, or we observe lower prices with dollar store entry. We haven't looked into the mechanisms why these perishable products might have lower prices. While those perishable products are having lower prices, when we look at fresh produce are having, we observe generally higher prices there. But this is also consistent with Sean, what you presented at the beginning in low-income households. When you look at who's spending in dollar stores, low-income households are are spending most, and our significant associations in this reduced form models. We actually, it is when we dissect it by income groups, most significant impacts are by the low income regions. So when we look at the aggregate, without sort of looking at low income regions or rural metro, most of these significant effects wash away. But when we are getting in more disaggregate levels there, where we are started finding some significant effects. Interestingly, so far at the rural level, generally, again, these are like lots of regressions here, but generally at the rural level, we haven't found any evidence in terms of significant effects whether on prices. Not sure yet, right? So we are still looking into that. We do have it for low income, but not necessarily for rural significant associations so far. So those are so far what we have. There is definitely heterogeneous impacts of dollar store on both store. That is, I mean, I should not say definitely, but really that is a very consistent theme that we are finding both on store impact on store formats. That is, some store formats are benefiting and some store formats are not. And there is also heterogeneous impacts on different demographics. And it will be interesting as we delve more into this research to sort of tease out those heterogeneous impacts as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Sandro, some additional comments on this question of impacts on competition and markups?
Can you go to the next slide, please?
You didn't have a slide here, right?
Find some, actually. Yeah, in one response, actually. Yeah.
Okay. Which?
Yeah, you can, if you want me to talk about the summary. No, you're a bit too far. You
All
already
right.
showed everything.
All right.
So, right, I mean, my response to what you just discussed, there's a lot of overlap in what we do, and there's a lot of interest actually in different components here that I think reflect actually on our work as well. So I decided to combine my response to what you're working on with what we actually working on with our co-op agreement. Could you move to the next slide, please? So, right, as introduced, we are interested on we zoom in our research on a particular issue, and that is that of independent grocery retailers and what happens if dollar store comes to town actually. So we use a very similar database in our research, and that is the National Establishment Time Series, which is also drawn from Dun & Bradstreet. Right, every business in the United States that want to operate needs a UNS number, and that's where you get all this very juicy establishment information actually on address of the business, the classification of that business. You get information on employment, sales, and etc. In our research, we're already a bit advanced, right, in terms of our analysis. We have a lot of results that I would like to show to you today, actually. And we measure actually the impact of dollars to entry on IGR survival, sales, and employment. And we use here competitive approaches, two-way fixed effect regression, event studies, but also competition ring models that have been recently actually coming up to try to better understand the potential competition effects. Next slide. Okay, so right, our main source is NETS data, the National Establishment Time Series, and we do our analysis here at the census tract level. So we constructed a unique panel that is running from 2000 to 2019. We decided to cut that panel in 2000. We could have been able to start in 1990 actually, but 2000 is a good start because that was when really this expansion of dollar stores started to take place. So we classified, while we went through the NETS database and actually classified the different store formats that are in terms of food retailing into grocery retailers, convenience stores, supercenters, warehouses, and specialty food stores. There's obviously that issue in terms of IGRs, right? How you identify IGR. We used a very, very similar approach here. We went through the different strings in terms of what a dollar store can be, from a family dollar to a Dollar General to all the other formats that actually exist throughout the United States. I think we had a list of about 35 different formats. That was a fun experience to go through them. But what we did with this data, actually, we wanted to dial down right into the businesses that are standalone in that sense. So we looked only into businesses that are standalone and where the headquarter is actually equal to the establishment. And that's an important distinction. So, but it's really only one store, and there are no other related businesses actually to that particular business. And we combined that with a database that we constructed from the American Community Survey and the census that basically allows us to get a lot of the demographic characteristics of census tracts from 2000 to 2019. We had to do some interpolation between 2000 and 2010, right? Because the American Community Survey doesn't really provide good measures before that actually. Okay. So the question is, right, what is competition and how you define competition in a market? And we in our approach here, right, we look into census tracts and we follow here the prevailing approach in the literature established by earlier works that basically says, hey, it's about 25,000 populations. That's the first measure to take. And the second measure to take is it more than 25 miles away from the next metropolitan area? And that's what we used here to actually establish our choice. As you see, right, most of the urban areas on the East Coast are excluded. Mostly the Midwest is included, California excluded, and Texas mostly included, actually, a part of Houston and the capital. Next slide. So first, right, our first approach was this very simple idea. Let's run a two-way fixed effect regression and see what we find in that data. We follow here, right, in our main outcomes are in that sense, the number of IGRs within a specific census tract, the sales, and as well as the employment in these census tracts. So in our approach, we account for two-dimensional fixed effects. So the standard ones, right, are census tract fixed effect, time fixed effect. That will be added to that is also a market year fixed effect that is hopefully allowing us to control for more of the market-specific trends that are taking place, as well as a bunch of census tract-specific controls, which are wide population, income, other competition that is taking place from supercenters and grocery stores, because that has been shown to be impacted also by dollar store entry or have impacts as on IGRs as well. In terms of estimation strategy, we rely here on because it's account data problems that we are dealing here, right? It's a number of businesses within a given census tract. We rely on a count data regression model, it's Poisson estimator. Okay, let me briefly highlight these estimates for you. So on the upper panel, you see all census tracts, and you see just focus on the estimates. And you see that right, if a dollar store comes to town, it basically reduces the number of IGRs by about 3%. Very similar employment effect, larger sales effect. If we focus only on the rural and isolated market, actually, we see that the adverse effect of dollar store entries are significantly larger. They are in terms of the number of businesses twice as large. Employment effects are less significant, but the sales effects are actually twice as large as well. What is interesting here is if you look at the estimator from panel B that shows count and employment, that actually the number of businesses and employment estimators are basically the same, right? So there isn't that they outsource or that they are actually out crowding smaller or larger businesses, that they outcrowd the average business, that is it. In addition, what you see is that is what the sales estimator actually tells us, is that the impact of sales is actually larger. So even the ones that stay in business, they lose sales. Can you go to the next one? So one concern that you should have here, right, about these estimates is that maybe that these markets where dollar store is entering, or the census tracts that dollar store is entering, are these markets that are, failing already, that are downward trending actually, and that's why you see these significant estimates, that's the negative treatment effects. So what we did actually to measure or account for these potential dynamics in treatment over time, we run just a simple event study actually that uses the same kind of fixed effect structure, but instead of having a time invariant static approach, we allow you for dynamics in the treatment effects. Okay, in terms of what is important here, we take a longer window because we want to see long-run trends, right? Are these markets just recently started to turn down, or are there long-term trends in these markets? So we open a window of -7 to +7 years to see what are the more longer-term trends actually into specific markets. Can you go to the next slide? And so what you see here are event study graphs with the sub-T events and sub-T confidence intervals, actually to be a bit more robust on our choice here. And what is interesting, actually, just look at the count of IGRs on the left side. There isn't really any strong evidence for pre-trend. So our pre-trend tests actually are all insignificant in that sense. But what is interesting is that the treatment effect, cost treatment effect, is not gradual. Right, an entry of a dollar store leads to immediate drop in the number of businesses and in a specific census tract that experiences an entry. But in the long run, right, and that is what you see with a 7+, it's a bid estimator, you see some recovery. Actually, there's some coming back to the before level. Employment effects, very similar, very stable, immediate hit, and they stay depressed basically in IGR employment. And the same holds for sales. Can you go to the next one? We did also a couple of robustness checks, right, to make sure that there isn't any issues with spillover effects, special spillover effects, etc. And we find that these effect estimates are really consistent and robust. In addition, we thought about, right, how we define competition. I mean, so far we use that simple approach, competition within the census tract, which is an administrative border that doesn't really tell us a lot about how competition is taking place within in a given region, because you are not limited by the census tract you are living. You can go to a neighboring census tract. So what we did in that study also, we constructed a unique establishment level data set that actually links the location of each IGR to an entry of a dollar store in competition links. So based on the position of an IGR, we drew competition rings around and we looked whether there's an entry taking place, basically. And we used the baseline two-way fixed effect regression actually to see whether entry in specific wings has a stronger or weaker impact. And the hypothesis here that we had is, yes, actually, if we think about competition, that should be something, right, you compete with someone who's close by, basically. And if we look into the results of our estimation, actually, and these are preliminary estimates because we are still working on these huge a matrix inversion, right? Trying to find distances between every store in America is a fun thing to do for any computer. And so this is our first round of results, and it might have still a couple of issues to it, but I still want to show you our initial estimates. I think they're very intriguing here, actually. So what we find is actually is that really when dollar store comes to town, it matters where it comes. So if it comes to close by the IGR, then we see the largest impacts, and these impacts are pretty large, right? An increase of 30% in the probability of an IGR leaving the market, a 35% drop in its employment in close by stores, and about 50% drop in sales. So that are quite some significant treatment effect in that sense. But the further you go out, right, the further you increase the distance, and this is all in kilometers. I have to convert it later to miles, actually. If you are 6 kilometers out of actually the location of the IGR, you find that these treatment effects basically disappear. So when we think about the entry of dollar stores in rural markets, actually, it's a close competition issue. That's the one that actually matters. If there's no dollar store entry in a close location to an IGR, then the competition actually doesn't seem to play a role in terms of overall IGR performance. Okay, so our findings actually are showing and confirming, based on that long pattern of the census tract, that there is actually a harming effect of IGR on IGRs due to dollar store entry. And these effects, as we see, right, it's not an issue of urban areas, it's more of an issue in rural areas. There is no evidence for significant special spillover effects. So really what we find is that close entry, close to an IGR, this is where dollar store really has the biggest impact. And overall, right, as dollar stores proliferation in rural America is still a very poorly understood issue in terms of the broader discussion about how we advocate for rural economic development and how we ensure health in these areas.
Great, thank you. We are running a bit low on time, and I want to make sure we have time for the last question, but Connor, did you have some comments, additional context here?
I just think that it's looking at these causal effects raises some interesting econometric questions. You see that two-way, I don't want to drag us into an econometric morass, but I can't help but think about this stuff. You see that these two-way fixed effects models are the workhorse of the analyses that we've seen. And we know from the modern differences literature that those models have problems if you have staggered treatments, where in this case, the staggered treatment would be the entry of a dollar store. Particularly but we have a set of tools that can adjust for those problems in the case of binary treatment. So if you want to limit yourself to defining a treatment as a dollar store presence or the entry of a dollar store, then really it's no problem to deal with those issues, at least in a linear model. But we know that from the data, and we know from what the major chains say themselves, that at least Dollar General and Family Dollar, they tend to proliferate in the same areas. So especially in urban areas, it's probably not just a story about whether there's a dollar store or not. It's a story about dollar store density or dollar store counts, like you were using in your data. The set of tools that we have developed to properly estimate these causal effects is not as well developed. I think that some of the imputation-based estimators, I'm thinking of, let's think it's Borusayak. That particular approach to modern diff and diff could be quite useful in this context. And there's a 2021 paper by Christensen et al. In RE Stat, I believe, that has a machine learning approach to these imputation-based estimators for staggered treatments. What's nice about that is then for every census tract at every point in time, whether they have a dollar store or not, you get an estimate of what would have happened to them in the absence of having any dollar stores. And then you can say, break census tracts up into quantiles of how many dollar stores they have at any given moment in time, and compare what you see happening to them to what would have happened to them in the absence of having any dollar stores. And since you've got a prediction for everybody's individual treatment effect, you can regress those on census tract characteristics and really dig into that heterogeneity. So that was probably not just a small comment, but something that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Point very well taken, and kind of along the same lines, there was another paper at our workshop 2 months ago with I forget the name of the fellow from University of Toronto, more of a modeling based approach. And
Yeah.
his results suggested a stronger crowding out of IGRs, right? He had kind of had a bit of an elasticity estimate there that was a little bit, I found larger than I would have expected. But
Yes.
again, so methods matter, models matter. And there's a lot to be done here still. Thank you so much for those comments, Connor and Sandro, for summarizing your work. Let's move into a fast discussion on some policy issues, particularly with regard to food and nutrition security. So really, in what ways can dollar store expansion support access to, actually, should we move ahead from there's this and there are 2 questions left?
No, there-
Okay, this one. Okay, so, all right. So-
Couple. Like, it was fine. It was great.
Okay,
This is
go
so
ahead, Lauren.
wonderful. Yeah. So I'm not going to spend too much time, but I'm just going to kind of end with just some highlights on the policy conversation around dollar stores. Like the conversation or the context around dollar stores is that they're emerging as a competitor in the food retail sector. And it's kind of interesting because dollar stores straddle this market between food and non-food items. And so the policy conversation has been influenced by this idea that they're competing with the food sector, and these legislation or these regulations that are kind of emerging are in the form of what's called dispersal policies. And dispersal policies are effectively a document that says, okay, within a certain mile of an existing dollar store, no new store format with these particular characteristics can enter. So the documents are not being written as dollar stores can't enter around another dollar store, but actually dollar store or stores with a certain number of square footage and who don't have a certain portion of their sales from fresh produce or fresh fruits and vegetables, that kind of thing, can't enter. And the thing is that like dollar stores themselves may fit that criteria, but other retail formats also fit that criteria, particularly those corner stores. And it's just an interesting policy conversation that's emerging at the moment where we have other policies that are counteracting dispersal policies in the form of financing initiatives to support the entry of corner stores. So my kind of interest in emerging in the implications of dollar store expansion on policy really are nested in this context. I hope that makes some sense. Am I making sense? I hope so. So anyhow, this is an article that I guess was just published in Nutrients, the McCarthy et al. So it's a little bit outdated, but these are just a list of some of those municipalities and areas that have introduced some dispersal policy. And you can see there are probably, 16 or so here. And the table lists, it's very, very small font, I apologize, but on the left-hand side, it lists the municipalities, the legal mechanism, so this is reading from left to right, the legal mechanism, the time period, whether it limits dollar store density, and then also describes whether there's a counteracting healthy food financing initiative to support that. Because if one municipality were to introduce a dispersal policy, they simultaneously should at least support that or counteract that with something else so that those corner stores are not the ones that are going to be most affected negatively by the other limiting policy. Just to say that as vague as I could possibly say. Next slide, please. And I'm going to end on this. I'm not going to even go into the SNAP conversation at all, but in what ways could dollar store expansion support nutritious foods? Well, ultimately, the way I think about answering this question is if we are to consider dollar stores as a format where they will continue to meet households in some capacity, meet their food needs in some capacity, then we really should take a close look at the existing policies that encourage any retailer, not just dollar stores, to possibly add, more healthful products to their stores. And the way that I kind of break this down is like the most difficult to the least quote unquote invasive option. And the most difficult option is to really take federal level action through the form of SNAP requirements, such that we look more closely at retailer eligibility standards. And that would encourage not just dollar stores, but all retailers who want to accept SNAP at their store. It would encourage all of them to kind of up their game regarding the standards. A sort of middle of the road option would be to emphasize or encourage those public-private partnerships in the form of healthy food financing initiatives. And then obviously the least invasive or like the least effort option is just do nothing. And that's certainly not very popular, but when it comes to food policies that do incentivize or even go so far as mandate stores to sell certain items, you'd have to consider those trade-offs. And I don't list them all here or list any here, but what would that mean for food prices is the kind of thing that comes top of mind too. To me. So I'm going to end with that because we have maybe like 7 minutes for questions. And I have some questions too. So I'm going to let you all do it too. But that's sort of it. We can probably go to the audience Q&A.
All right. Metin, any fast comments on that as well?
So, I mean, when it comes to dollar stores and food insecurity, that is not an area that I have directly looked at. But like if so if we, I mean, we gotta leave the questions, but if we dissect the food insecurity issue, so that is how do we improve that? It's access. We have more access to food, both affordable and nutritious food. Then the parts that we have looked at and how that. So what have we looked at dollar store and entry exit of other stores, dollar stores, and its effect on prices. So there is no right now sort of like it's a clear evidence on dollar stores impact on prices. So like not at least at the aggregate level, and that's not surprising, as in the last time I actually looked at the data, looking to find out what is the dollar store share in the total food sales share in the United States, that was less than 1% in 2015. So like thinking about since 2015 to 2022, of course, dollar stores expanded and they probably increased their food sales and adding new. That is definitely more than 1% now, and it's been increasing because it was very low. It has the highest percentage increase, but I'm not sure if it is more than 3% of all food sales in the United States. So dollar stores are still not a big players in the food space compared to all others. So would that, would that impact the food insecurity at the very aggregate level? That's why like on the prices, perhaps at the aggregate level, we're not finding any impact on prices. Like more on like local areas, we do have some significant we do pick up some significant effects in terms of access. Does dollar store improve access? So we do find, yes, dollar store impacts small groceries to leave. IGRs are small, or other small formats leave, but the SNAP households, more than 90% of their redemption is in supercenters and large supermarkets. So if dollar stores are sort of, if they are if small formats are exiting, but if that's not where SNAP households are shopping from, again, it's not clear whether would have a negative impact food insecurity. In the infra at the maybe, so that is about both, in terms of SNAP households access, whether they can afford, whether they can, find food. Dollar stores might at the infra margin allow for, if they allow households who are eligible but not participating to say, SNAP, and now there is a dollar store in an area that there was like no other stores, then I think it would have a positive impact improving the food insecurity, but I have no idea. Like, I don't think we have any evidence on that either. Yes, dollar stores are getting these remote places. Where dollar stores are, do we observe increased participation in SNAP? If we do, I think then
So some of the data we have from the IRI data we're looking at, we do see that for identifiable subgroups, and it's particularly in rural areas, we start to see though with that food dollar getting towards 10 and 20% for some, small but readily observable subgroups. So that, so that is part of, I think, kind of getting at that.
Right.
Yeah, very heterogeneous, but becoming very important, at least for some people in some places.
Yeah.
We really just want to make sure we have some time for audience comments because we're almost at time here. So any quick comments or questions? Yes.
It's quite different. Their business model very different than Walmart. I mean, yes, Walmart is one-stop shop, right? But dollar stores, we can. I mean, they are small. They are small stores. They are very limited variety. Their business model is quite different. They are expanding their food sales on that front. But would there ever become these large 100,000 SKU stores? No, that's not their business model. So I think they'll be staying small. Would they become a huge player in the food industry? In some parts, as Sean also mentioned, in some regions where might be identified as low income, low access, food deserts, presence of dollar stores might be very important to food access, but in I don't know. I mean, my guess for the next 20 years, it would be really hard to see dollar stores playing a similar role what we saw with Walmart. It's just that's not the business model.
Right. And we talk about the business model, something we haven't discussed. Their distribution model is the most rigid part of their business model. So it's not just the marketing and the location. They have a very different distribution model. We probably have the least data on that, and it's the hardest to get eyes on that, but that's a lot of what defines them. And that's part of what limits some of these initiatives or the ability of them to respond to some of these public pressures that have come from community groups and advocacy groups.
Yeah, I know. They're big number, but they're small in volume. So they're like little government.
Yeah.
Like Walmart. But my question is, to what extent do you think that this food type quality that people are correlating with dollar stores, is it a supply problem or is it a demand problem? Alcott had a paper in which he, on food desert actually, in which he kind of pointed out with several evidence in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2020 that it was really a demand problem. That even when you do experiments, people move to a non-food desert and food-rich areas. People still, I'm not eating well. So, to what extent do you think it's a demand problem or supply problem? If you're building, they will come. Put the vegetables, which are expensive anywhere. Do you think that would improve significantly with the quality of low-income population in our stores?
Sure.
Well, yeah, so I think I still think it's definitely more of a demand side, and in fact I'm going to punt it over to Sean because he said something earlier too that really what some of the evidence that they're finding when they're looking at the nutritional quality of the foods, that the HEI scores at the different formats, that yes, the HEI scores at the dollar stores are lower, but could that be because the shoppers that are shopping there are buying the lower quality foods at the dollar store, but then saving the money and spending it at the places where they would be able to buy higher quality products, traditionally speaking, like the supermarkets and things. That's not to say though, that like, can you get down to the household level and tease out some of those demand, like the preferences?
Yeah, and I'm Lena, feel free to chime in on this because Lena was just standing near our poster at 9 but we definitely saw strong evidence of compensatory behavior, at least at the mean, that if you're buying more low quality items, shelf stable items, et cetera, at the dollar stores, it seems to be you're freeing up part of that food dollars then buy other things elsewhere. Alina, is anything more on that? And, and the thing that I haven't seen any economists working on, which surprises me, but I've seen some of the investigative reporting on, is also about this unit price, right? And there's been some investigative reporting that a lot of things at dollar stores aren't bargains. You're just getting smaller formats. It's obviously part of the model. And the cheapest way to get anything is to have a freezer and a car and be able to go to the club stores, right? So there's this aspect of pricing in the moment versus pricing over time that is very much an income access, right? And so, and that's part of the niche that seems to be getting filled here as well. But in that sense, dollar stores plus access to something else can be a very good model for for households that are trying to increase the dietary quality.
Sean,
We should end it here so that
Right.
we can go to other sessions.
This was great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Thank you. And thanks to our participants online as well. And thank you, Lauren, for organizing this.
You bet.
That was great.
That was great, right? So